build, right? So your DNA is essentially your blueprints that you start with. But you need this nutrition at particular times in your life to be able to build it in the right way. And if you don't get that nutrition at the right times in the right places, distributed to the right places, then you're not going to have built what your DNA was setting out to do. Now, how does that work exactly? This is a mechanistic, mechanical process. You've got your DNA blueprint, and it's got all these codes. What happens is there is a pair to DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. That's your DNA strand, your genetic sequence. And there is what's called ribonucleic acid, or RNA, and a particular form called messenger RNA, or mRNA, which lives in your cell, and you've got your nucleus with your blueprints in there. And messenger RNA is the one thing that can go in and out of the blueprints. It's like your project manager for your construction project. They go into the site office, they consult the blueprints, they look at it and say, okay, we need bricks right now. We need to build a wall. I'm going to go back out to the shop floor, go to this particular organelle, and I will tell them to build these bricks. Now, I'm saying bricks as a metaphor. What I mean is there are amino acids that are being built. And your DNA has the instructions for what and when to build particular things. The entire sequence. Now, a heart cell is going to be is going to be accessing different parts of that blueprint. It has the whole blueprint in there, but it's saying we're a heart cell and we need to build this type of material. A brain cell is going to build a different type of material. Your bone cells are going to build a different type of material. And so your messenger RNA goes in, consults the correct part of that DNA sequence based on some instructions that are given to it, which is also part of the DNA structure. And then it leaves the nucleus and it tells ribosomes to produce in the cell nucleus to produce amino acid chains that are used for all of these things that you do, and those are in a list in your book. Now, how does it know to do this? Well, this is through things like regulatory genes. These are on-off switches that tell your cells to do things at particular times. We know a lot about this because we study it, of course, but in a kind of a strange way, we know a lot about regulatory genes from when they don't work, when they're broken. When regulatory genes aren't functioning properly in people, we can actually see anomalies arise. Things like Marfan syndrome is something that we all have a size, right? When we stop growing at a particular age. But for some people, those regulatory genes aren't working properly, and Marfan syndrome means people will become extremely elongated, they have longer fingers, they're quite gaunt, and there can be health problems. It's thought that Abraham Lincoln, for instance, might have had Marfan syndrome. Also, we're hairy, right? We're like other mammals, we have hair, but where does that grow? For me, it'd be nice if it was on my head, it's not, but why is it growing here on my face? Well, regulatory genes tell the body where and when and how and what kind of things to do. So my arm hair I don't have to tell it, I don't have to go to the barber and cut my arm hair, because it is regulating when that stops growing. It's a teleogenic hair that's here. But the hair on my face is anogenic, which means it will continue to grow until it's down to my feet if I don't cut it. And in quarantine right now, I'm letting it grow as long as I want. You also have things like, we know that birds are probably the descendants of certain types of dinosaurs, and dinosaurs used to have teeth, but adaptations have occurred such that birds have beaks now and they don't tend to have teeth. But sometimes those regulatory genes don't work and you get things like chickens that have teeth, because they still have the genetic sequence from dinosaurs, but it's their genes, their regulatory genes are telling them to switch off growing teeth. Whereas in some chickens where they have broken regulatory genes, that off switch for growing teeth isn't working properly, and they grow teeth nonetheless. Also, you have homeotic or Hox genes, which are tell an organism a certain plan, that we're growing bone structure. You know, we're growing hard bones for our bodies to support our frames and things. But how do those grow? Well, for a python, it's going to be a very long, thin, snaky snake, right? But what if we had a spine like that? Imagine trying to stand upright with just a straight spine. We'd fall over one way or the other. So what we have is a curve to our spine. So we have the same bones, the same number, the same kind of vertebrae in our spines as a snake does, but ours are put together in a different way because they're configured as a whole organism, and we have adapted upright walking, and that S-shaped curve to our back is more advantageous for that posture. Also, even a Hox gene for like a fruit fly or a mouse or a goose or a python or a human, all of these have things like the head structure, the thorax structure, and these are all things that we share. So some of these Hox genes are spread throughout many organisms that provide similarities because we have a shared history. I talked a little bit last class about things like recessive alleles and dominant alleles. And so sometimes in this recombination, the expression of particular characteristics can be dominant. And so you can have a red-headed gene and never know it until future generations it creeps up because you are recombining in exactly the right characteristics. But it's because it's always recessive, it's only expressed under certain conditions, conditions of reproduction. That's the word I'm looking for. But you can also have things like codominance. There are some characteristics which do blend together. So something like skin color is something that is codominant. That you can often have a dark complected parent and a light complected parent that comes together somewhere in between. And this highlights the fact that we've been looking at the combination of traits through reproduction and the way that genes are mixed up together to create variety that natural selection works on. And just because we have the genome unraveled and we can sort of see what human DNA looks like, and it doesn't mean that we understand everything about everything, because it doesn't work in just a straight line. That you have a gene that has an effect, right? So we saw that in those triplet codes, that this sequence of genetic information will tell a cell to do this thing, right? So this cause has this effect. That's great when we can get that. That's very straightforward. But you can also have one gene that has multiple effects, right? And finding those is a little bit more complicated, and we're still learning a lot about that. Likewise, you can have an effect that has multiple genes that are causing it. And so this is where lots of traits are what we call polygenic. That is to say, a height, skin color, these things are actually from different genes throughout your sequence that all result in one effect, right? But you also have pleiotropy, which is one gene having multiple effects. And then, not to mention, this is going to be a cause for another chapter on the subject, that all traits that are expressed in your living body are a combination of the starting point, that blueprint, right? Where you start with your genes, and whether you have the right nutrition and the right environment to express those in the way that is similar to what the genes were put there for, or what they were. The blueprints were sort of, intending is the wrong word, but so all traits are a product of genes and the environment, right? And so, how tall are you? Well, your genes may have said you're going to be 6 feet tall, but maybe you didn't get nutrition at the right time when you were growing up, and you never made it to 6 feet tall. This is what's called epigenetics. And we're going to have a whole chapter on the relationship between your starting point of your gene, which is your genotype. So you were born with a genotype as a single-celled organism, but as you grew up, you have expressed traits, and these are called phenotypes. And really, the phenotype is kind of the important thing, that the genes are passed down, and that is what is being selected, but natural selection is acting upon living organisms, which is a phenotype, not the genotype. So this is an important distinction to make, that your genes are just the starting point, and it's really your phenotype, which is the collection of your own characteristics. All right, we'll come back to this subject next class.